Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, the doom of the Noldor and the consequences of the slaying of the Teleri at Alqualondë. And then the Noldor do what the elves do best, what we have seen most consistently in the behavior of the elves from the very beginning. They separate themselves into two distinct and separate parts. Then we rewind a couple of thousand years to find out what has been happening with all the elves still stranded on the shores of Middle-earth, because there's a story to be told there for sure. And if we have time, we will even make it as far as Chapter 11 and an intro to revised cosmology. I know I said we were going to cover chapters 10 and 11 this week, but chapter 11 is a curious beast. So my inclination right now, here at the beginning of today's session, is to hold off on chapter 11 until next week, but we'll see how things progress. We will see how way leads on to way and how much ground we can cover between here and there. Glorfin David is joining me in the chat. Hi, Glorfin David. It's another Sunday afternoon recording here. I inadvertently just messed up my schedule. I wanted to reset a little bit and move around the schedule just a little, move from Thursday nights to try and make this recording, this live session that is available to a few other people in other parts of the world. And unfortunately, I have now committed myself to 3 consecutive weeks on a Sunday afternoon, but then we'll be back on a Thursday evening. Then we'll be back in our regular slot. This is not an ongoing change. This is the second of 3 sessions that will be in a Sunday afternoon, and then we'll see where we are after that. Who knows where we will bounce around to. And while I'm making these random announcements at the beginning of the episode, I know I promised last week that there would be some short-form streaming video, but the pipeline to produce that short-form streaming video isn't quite there yet, because I'm in this curious creative position where everything that I have to do next requires me to have already done 2 other things, but each of those things are also dependent on 2 other things. So it's just this interesting Gordian knot of process here as I'm not necessarily announcing this formally right now, you understand, but as I spin up a new Tolkien show, I know I've talked about this a few places on the internet, but as I spin up a new Tolkien show that is going to run concurrently with Stars and Swords once we're done with the Silmarillion, I'm really, really looking forward to that, but it's going to be a slightly different show. It's slightly distinct from any other format that I've done before, but I'm really excited to get into that. And that means, of course, that there's naming and branding and social media accounts to be found and all of that kind of nonsense. So that's been occupying my time this week. But those short form videos are coming, and I think you're really going to enjoy them. I, at least, am really enjoying them. So lots of news to look forward to for all of us, but particularly for you, happy and constant Silmarillion heirs. Let's get into our discussion then of the end of chapter 9. And the fallout from the first kinslaying of the elves, the murder of the Teleri at Alqualondë. I did get a couple of questions in the via email over the course of the last week, seeking clarification, seeking a kind of a consolation here in the aftermath of the kinslaying. That are all of the Teleri dead, or do some of the Teleri survive? And the answer is that some of the Teleri survive. We don't get a firm figure on that, but yes, the Teleri are not extinguished at this point. We are. And we're really going to see this at the beginning of the next chapter, at the beginning of chapter 10. But we are really at this point pivoting away from Valinor as the root of our story to Middle-earth proper. We're going to see a real shift in the way that we approach language, right? We're going to see the move from Quenya to Sindarin really happen in the next chapter, and then very forcefully happen shortly thereafter. But we're moving away from Valinor as our setting here. So we're not going to spend a lot of time back with the Valar, back with the Teleri, although we are going to revisit the creation of the sun and the moon in chapter 11, which, as I say, we might even get to today. So we have the kinslaying, we have the stealing of the swan boats of Alqualondë, we have Feanor's people fleeing north, which we'll get to in just a moment, and we have the scourge of the sea, I suppose, right? We talked a little about this last week, about Uinen's tears leading to the sea rising against the fleet of Feanor here. And exactly what the mechanism there, exactly how we are supposed to understand it. And I was rereading it this weekend because I'm in the middle of putting together like some higher order thoughts on the Valar and the Maiar and their interaction with what we might scientifically think of as the systems of Arda, right? What is the nature of the power of the Maiar within the frame of Arda, peculiarly within the frame of Middle-earth? We're going to be talking about Melian, of course, later in this week's session. And as I've been thinking about that, and as I return to this passage, I was struck by the injunction placed by the Valar against any interference with the Noldor during their flight, which I think we're supposed to take as confirmation that the rising of the seas is not something that Uinen is doing per se, but rather a reflection of her emotional state, right? We talked a little about the pathetic fallacy last week and how that fallacy leads us to believe that the external world is mirroring our internal worlds, right? That our emotional state is reflected in the weather around us or in the environment around us. But of course, is that fallacious? When you are of the Maiar, if you are a Maya in the service of Ulmo, is it really necessarily fallacious to say that the sea is actually reflecting your emotional state? So I think that it is to me pretty clear that it is an inadvertent reflection of Weenan's state. And I think that we can clarify that too, in that it isn't Osei who is rising against the Noldorian fleet heading north now. Osei, of course, who was rambunctious, who was more violent, who was more inclined to causing chaos, to, at the very least, causing mischief. Osei, who was aligned, we must remember, with Melkor much earlier in the story of Arda, and then was rehabilitated, not least of all by Uinen, his wife, and fell sway to her gentling influence there. So that's kind of how I'm reading that, but stay tuned for more on that. And if you have thoughts on exactly how we are to understand this question that we've returned to, I think, again and again as we've moved through the pages of the Silmarillion, how we are to understand exactly the use of power within Arda. What does it mean for the Valar, for the Maiar to exercise their power within this realm? And by extension, and I'm not drawing a clean delineation here, but rather placing these things on a spectrum. What does it mean for Feanor to wield his power? What does it mean for Thingol to wield his power as we move forward through this week's reading? I have some big thoughts in that space, and we'll see how they work out in the weeks to come. So from there, we get to the doom of the Noldor. We get to the reason that we are entitling this week's session simply Doom. No, it's not a reference to the early 90s first-person shooter, which I never really liked, but did play dozens of hours of, because that's what playing video games was like back in the 90s, you guys. You had one game and you did the best you could with it. No, this is the doom of the Noldor. This is this prophetic voice. This is the thing which gives shape to the long tragedy of Feanor's people going forward into Middle-earth. Let's take a look at our first slide of this week's show. Nonetheless, the greater part of the Noldor escaped, and when the storm was past, they held on their course, some by ship and some by land, but the way was long and ever more evil as they went forward. After they had marched for a great while in the unmeasured night, they came at length to the northern confines of the guarded realm, upon the borders of the empty waste of Araman, which were mountainous and cold. There they beheld suddenly a dark figure standing high upon a rock and looked down upon the shore. Some say that it was Mandos himself, and no lesser herald of Manwë, and they heard a loud voice, solemn and terrible, that bade them stand and give ear. Then all halted and stood still, and from end to end of the hosts of the Noldor the voice was heard speaking the curse and prophecy, which is called the prophecy of the North and the doom of the Noldor. Much it foretold in dark words, which the Noldor understood not until the woes indeed after befell them, and all heard the curse that was uttered upon those who would not stay nor seek the doom and pardon of the Valar. So, the Noldor, having survived the ravages of Weenan's seas here, Weenan's coastal waters, they are still progressing north, some by ship and some by land, because presumably some of the people on the land there have survived the sinking of some of the swan boats previously of Alqualondë. So they head north, they leave behind the actual guarded realm. Right now we're out in the wastes of Araman, we're in the trackless tundra north of Aman, and we are visited by a dark figure. And I love the ambiguity that we get here. Some say that it was Mandos himself and no lesser herald of Manwë. I have no question at all in my heart of hearts whether or not this is Mandos. This is absolutely Mandos. Who else is more suited to, putting on an impressive looking cloak and just looming over the Noldor, right? I think that I really think that this feels to me like Mandos. This feels to me like the guy who's not the first in the judgment there, and has these little pithy commentaries from the sidelines. This feels Mandos is a theater kid, I think is what I'm saying. Mandos is just a theater kid who wants very much the center spotlight. And this works for me. Even the repetition there of upon, right? There they beheld suddenly a dark figure standing high upon a rock that looked down upon the shore, right? We're just arraying this vertical orchestration of his position here. And that feels to me, yes, very, very Mandos. I'll clarify too here, this last sentence. Much it foretold in dark words, which the Noldor understood not until the woes indeed after befell them. So they're hearing this prophecy, but they don't understand exactly what it is, what it means, until these events come to pass. And then they recognize them. They recognize them from the doom of the Noldor. But all heard the curse that was uttered upon those who would not stay nor seek the doom and pardon of the Valar. And again, we're kind of semi-turning our use of the word doom there. Again, Tolkien loves wielding this word because of its ambiguity to modern ears, right? Doom, as I've said before, simply means like judgment. It means an ordination almost. It means a decision as to how things are going to unfold. The doom of the Noldor is the judgment upon the Noldor, but it's also, yes, the doom of the Noldor in the more colloquial sense here. So they all hear the words of this prophecy. Every Noldor, from end to end of the host of the Noldor, right? They all hear the words of Mandos here upon this rock, but they don't comprehend all of them until those events much later come to pass. What are the words of the prophecy of the North, the doom of the Noldor? Well, I'm very glad you asked, because this is an absolute knockout passage. Tears unnumbered ye shall shed, and the Valar will fence Valinor against you and shut you out, so that not even the echo of your lamentation shall pass over the mountains. On the house of Feanor the wrath of the Valar lieth from the west unto the uttermost east, and upon all that will follow them it shall be laid also. Their oath shall drive them, and yet betray them, and ever snatch away the very treasures that they have sworn to pursue. To evil end shall all things turn that they begin well, and by treason of kin unto kin, and the fear of treason, shall this come to pass. The dispossessed shall they be forever. Ye have spilled the blood of your kindred unrighteously, and have stained the land of Aman. For blood ye shall render blood, and beyond Aman ye shall dwell in death's shadow. For though arrow appointed to you to die not in Ea, and no sickness may assail you, yet slain ye may be, and slain ye shall be, by weapon, and by torment, and by grief. And your houseless spirits shall come then to Mandos. There long shall ye abide, and yearn for your bodies, and find little pity, though all whom ye have slain should entreat for you. And those that endure in Middle-earth shall come not to Mandos, shall grow weary of the world as with a great burden, and shall wane, and become as shadows of regret before the younger race that cometh after. The Valar have spoken. Then many quailed, but Feanor hardened his heart and said, We have sworn, and not lightly. This oath we will keep. We are threatened with many evils, and treason not least. But one thing is not said, that we shall suffer from cowardice, from cravens, or the fear of cravens. Therefore I say we will go on, and this doom I add. The deeds that we shall do shall be the matter of song until the last days of Arda. Kind of unintentional, somewhat poetic inversion there at the end, of course, because he's absolutely right. Feanor manages to keep this part of his oath with complete clarity and complete purpose. Yes, all the deeds of Feanor shall be the matters of song until the ends of Arda, but not good songs, not happy songs, not victorious songs. So, as I mentioned, the Noldor can hear these words, but they don't understand all of the meanings, so there are things here which will spark a kind of association with later events, right? There will be, as we get to chapter 20, there will be a battle, of unnumbered tears. Tears unnumbered ye shall shed, right? We're going to get to that reference in chapter 20 of this book. And these other elements are going to spark too. Their oath shall drive them, and yet betray them, and ever snatch away the very treasures that they have sworn to pursue. Mandos here, or whoever this herald of Manwë happens to be, Mandos here acknowledging that the oath that Feanor swore, which seemed to stem from a certain perspective, from this desire for vengeance upon the killers of his father, in fact, is all about the Silmarils. This is just about the pursuit. Their oath shall drive them, and yet betray them, and ever snatch away the very treasures that they have sworn to pursue. The dispossessed shall they be forever. And then we get right into it. Why is this happening? Because you have spilled the blood of your kindred unrighteously and have stained the land of Aman, right? This is the consequence directly of the kinslaying. This is not the consequence of leaving Valinor. That's completely copacetic. You can leave anytime you like, but you have killed your kin. It's not even necessarily the taking of the swan boats of Aqualonde, though, as we mentioned last week, we position those swan boats absolutely explicitly as being somewhat like unto the Silmarils. They are a singular creation of the Teleri at Aqualonde in exactly the same way as we are led to believe, at least, the Silmarils are a singular creation of Feanor, or Telperion and Laurelin are a singular creation of Yavanna, right? We discussed last time how some of these creative acts cannot be replicated, and the swan boats are explicitly one of those, but the theft of the swan boats is still not sufficient to levy this doom against the Noldor. It is explicitly the slaying of their kindred. For though arrow appointed you to die not in Ea, and no sickness may assail you. So, you were created with the intention that you would live forever. There was never an idea that the elves would have to die. That's just not a part of the original concept of Arda, the original concept of Ea in general, right? You are to die not in Ea, and no sickness may assail you. Yet slain ye may be, and slain ye shall be. In the most devastating little rhetorical flourish there from Mandos. By weapon, and by torment, and by grief, and your houseless spirit shall come to Mandos. So there is a provision here for what happens to elves who die through misadventure, through violence, certainly. We have seen this already, of course, with Feanor's mother, first with Midiosindere, and her loss of life, which is obviously a different thing. Like, it's of a different nature. It's of a different kind of category of experience than what will happen to many of the Noldor, what has already happened to many of the Noldor, many of the Teleri too. But of course, we've also, heard tell of Finwë's death at the hands of Melkor, Feanor's father, of course. So, slain ye may be, slain ye shall be, by weapon and by torment and by grief, and your houseless spirit shall come then to Mandos. There long shall ye abide and yearn for your bodies and find little pity, though all whom ye have slain would entreat for you. Even if everyone who is in there, who you have killed and caused to be killed, entreats for you, if everyone there argues for your restoration to your body, you will not be returned to your body. And this is one of the points in the text here where we can kind of sense by implication what the original system for the elves was supposed to be. And we talked a little about this with the death of Midiosindere too, right? That she departs her body and everyone's like, oh, well, she's resting, so maybe she'll come back. Maybe at some point her Fea will return to her Hroa, her spirit will return to her corporeal form. That seems to be what elves are supposed to do. That seems to be the original conception of a kind of elven life, or elven experience, elven lifespan, perhaps in the broadest sense. That there would be a kind of physical, corporeal reincarnation that would not include the reincarnation of any kind of spirit. That your spirit could depart your physical form and then return to your physical form, or embody a new physical form that is the same as the old, right? That there would be a continuity of experience. But that is being explicitly broken here for Feanor and the followers of Feanor. If they die, they will go to the halls of Mandos and they will stay there no matter what. They will not be permitted to return to corporeal form. And those that endure in Middle-earth, those that manage to make it through, those that manage to survive, and they come not to Mandos, shall still grow weary of the world as with a great burden, and shall wane and become as shadows of regret before the younger race that cometh after the Valar have spoken. This is the judgment. Even if you survive, you are going to become less and less and less than you are. And there's a really interesting question to be asked there about the nature of life and existence in Tolkien's world, within the conceptualization of Ea, because as we've been talking about these acts of singular creation, as we've been talking about the need for even the Valar to rest after they have exerted themselves mightily. You remember way back in the days of the lamps illuminating Middle-earth that both Aule and Tukas had to seek rest because they were fatigued. We have to wonder whether a long, slow decline into lesserness is an inevitable and inextricable part of Tolkien's conceptual schematic for the way that the world operates. And of course, in the one hand, it is, right? We know for sure metatextually that it is, because he's giving us this accounting of how we come from the great days of old to our diminished modern world, right? There's no question that the modern world is infinitely less than the first age was, right? The great days of the Eldar, yes. I think that we can see that absolutely. But we're going to get an opportunity to contrast this accounting of the Noldor here with the Sindar that we're about to become reacquainted with, and to some extent the dwarves too. We're going to get another reference about this idea of a long, slow decline through the ages of Arda. We'll get perspectives on that. Here we're getting an implied perspective from the Noldor. We're going to get a perspective on the Sindar, and we're definitely going to get a perspective on the dwarves too in the pages to come. I want to call out here to Feanor's... I mean, I noted the irony there, right? The ambiguous irony of the matter of song until the last days of Arda. Yes, absolutely. His response initially seems strong. His response initially seems somewhat forthright, right? An evil kind of forthright, for sure, right? He's a long way past what the moral event horizon at this point, for sure. We have sworn, and not lightly, this oath we shall keep, right? we have taken the oath that we explored in last week's session, and we're going to hold to it. We are threatened with many evils and treason not least. So he's already feeling this risk of treason and betrayal. But one thing is not said. In all of your judgment here, Mandos, you can tell me exactly who we are and what we are and why we are awful and what terrible things are going to befall us. Oh no, Galadriel is telling me that YouTube's not showing the current live stream. That's terrible. I don't know what to do about that right now, Galadriel. I'm sorry. I will need to figure that out. I will persevere. I'm so sorry if this isn't working. I apologize. I will just try and make it work. It's hard to get into that stuff to fix it when I'm already underway. It's part of the problem. But hopefully, I mean, if all else fails, this is just the trial run for the podcast version anyway, right? This is why we record these. Yes. Oh, when you look it up on the channel, it doesn't show. Oh, I see. So what happens is that we run these unlisted when they're live so that it can be, a special little place just for the people who follow the Patreon page and get the live stream. And then I make it public afterwards. So that may be what it is. The live streams are normally just available through the link from the Patreon page or over on the Next Word Discord. If you don't support Next Word on Patreon, you can also just head over to the Patreon page and follow that page for free. And yeah. And Glorfin David says that he received the link in the Patreon email. That's normally how it goes out. Yes, I hope that's working. It's the whole system is just a collection of complicated mechanisms duct taped together. And I just hope every week that I press the button to start it all rolling and that it will continue to work. I'm still laboring, of course, under my own personal doom of Mandos here. Feanor here is saying, this oath we will keep. We're threatened with many evils, treason not least. One thing is not said. In all of Mandos' declarations here about the Noldor, it is not said that the Noldor are cowards, that they are going to suffer from cowardice, from cravens, or from the fear of cravens. That is to say that they are not themselves going to be frightened, they're not going to be frightened of people who are frightened, and they're not going to be frightened at the specter of other people who are frightened, right? It's just a complicated thing. It's a complicated thing for them to navigate here because of that fear of betrayal, because of that fear of treason. Because what I'm getting to, what I'm alluding gently to, I suppose, is the idea that this fear of betrayal and this fear of treason, this positioning of the Noldor as a vulnerable people who are going to become assaulted from those within, certainly, and also from those without. And this is a disaster of a day because now my phone is ringing, so we're going to turn that off too. Good Lord, you guys. Sunday afternoons are maybe not the time for doing this live show. That there is an irony there, that the thought that other people might betray you is in fact a kind of cowardice, that it is in fact a kind of, or at least irresolution. It is a kind of lack of faith in the world, in the ordering of the world around you. What we're witnessing here from Feanor, even as he is proudly declaiming his own courage and that he is proudly declaring that he's going to go on and that they're going to hold to their oath and that they're going to pursue the Silmarils no matter what, even as we're holding to those things, he's demonstrating how far from grace he has fallen. He's demonstrating fundamentally how wrong he is. And it is that fear of betrayal that is going to lead to betrayal. It is that paranoia that is going to lead him to isolation, more so than ever when we get back to Middle-earth. But I think the next slide, in fact, let's get on to that as we move forward. But in that hour, Finarfin forsook the march and turned back, being filled with grief and with bitterness against the house of Feanor because of his kinship with Olwe of Aquilonde. And many of his people went with him, retracing their steps in sorrow, until they beheld once more the far beam of the Minden upon Tuna still shining in the night, and so came at last to Valinor. There they received the pardon of the Valar, and Finarfin was set to rule the remnant of the Noldor in the Blessed Realm. But his sons were not with him, for they would not forsake the sons of Fingolfin, and all Fingolfin's folk went forward still, feeling the constraint of their kinship and the will of Feanor, and fearing to face the doom of the Valar, since not all of them had been guiltless at the kinslaying at Aquilonde. Moreover, Fingon and Turgon were bold and fiery of heart, and loath to abandon any task to which they must put their hands until the bitter end, if bitter it must be. So the main host went on, and swiftly the evil that was foretold began its work. The Noldor came at last far into the north of Arda, and they saw the first teeth of the ice that floated in the sea, and knew that they were drawing nigh to the Helcaraxe. For between the land of Aman that in the north curved eastward and the east shores of Endor, which is Middle-earth, that bore westward, there was a narrow strait, through which the chill waters of the encircling sea and the waves of Belegar flowed together, and there were vast fogs and mists of deathly cold, and the sea streams were filled with clashing hills of ice and the grinding of ice deep sunken. Such was the Helcaraxe, and there none yet had dared to tread, save the Valar only, and Ungoliant. Almost slipped in my pronunciation of Ungoliant there. So we see here immediately, right? The betrayal that was foretold has now taken place. Finarfin forsakes the march. This is the youngest brother, the youngest of the three brothers of Finwë, of course. And he has this kinship with Olwe of Aqualonde. Specifically, he's married to Eärwen, the swan maiden of Aqualonde, the daughter of Olwe. So Olwe, the king of those Teleri who were just murdered so that Fëanor could steal his boats, that's Finarfin's father-in-law. So it's a very close kinship. It's a very close connection here. So he turns back and returns to the pardon of the Valar. The Valar understand and pardon them their deeds. And you'll note that while we get this accounting that not everyone turns back, not all of them had been guiltless in the kinslaying at Aqualonde, right? So some stay out because they're worried about the judgment of the Valar having slain the Teleri at Aqualonde. We don't know if everyone who went back was guiltless. We don't know if everyone who went back was free from blood on their hands, but it doesn't matter because the Valar pardon them. And there is a kind of restitution there. We can see a kind of restoration there even, right? That Finarfin is then given rulership over those Noldor that remain. But then we get to my favorite geographical feature in the entire Legendarium. I just think there's basically nothing better than the Helcaraxe. I think it is a fantastic word that also is so evocative and so powerful. Oh, I should call out here, I suppose, since it's definitely going to come up, Endor. A very familiar word to some of us who have studied other texts in the speculative fiction space. No forest moon here, though. Endor here literally just means Middle Earth. It just the door is the land suffix that we see all over. Gondor is the land of stone. Gon meaning stone, Dor meaning land. So here, Endor, and En here, just means middle. So it is just the middle land. It is literally Middle Earth. It's not used often in the Legendarium, and I don't know that we need another name for it, honestly. I don't know that we need another name for the Hitherlands or for those lands outside of Aman and the Blessed Realm. But yes, the east shores of Endor bear westward, so there is this tiny little narrow strait filled with the grinding ice, which is the literal translation there of the Helcaraxe, right? Such was the Helcaraxe, and there yet none had dared to tread, save the Valar only and Ungoliant. Counting Melkor amongst the Valar there in an interesting way, right? If we are to take that very literally, this is the passage that Melkor uses to flee from Aman into Middle Earth after stealing the Silmarils, of course. So those people that... I did want to call out to Fingolfin's folk. All Fingolfin's folk went forward still, feeling the constraint of their kinship and the will of Fëanor, and fearing to face the doom of the Valar, since not all of them had been guiltless in the kinslaying at Aqualonde. So they are going along partly because they don't want to go back and face the music for what they have done at Aqualonde, but also partly because of the oath, because of their bond, because of their kinship and the will of Fëanor. Let's move forward then and see what happens, because crossing the sea is not as easy as it should be. Therefore, Fëanor halted, and the Noldor debated what course they should now take. But they began to suffer anguish from the cold and the clinging mists through which no gleam of star could pierce, and many repented of the road and began to murmur, especially those that followed Fingolfin, cursing Fëanor and naming him as the cause of all the woes of the Eldar. But Fëanor, knowing all that was said, took counsel with his sons, and two courses only they saw to escape from Araman and come into Endor, by the straits or by ship. But the Helcaraxe they deemed impassable, whereas the ships were too few. Many had been lost upon their long journey, and there remained now not enough to bear across all the great hosts together. Yet none were willing to abide upon the western coast, while others were ferried first. Already the fear of treachery was awake among the Noldor. Therefore it came into the hearts of Fëanor and his sons to seize all the ships and depart suddenly, for they had retained the mastery of the fleet since the Battle of the Haven, and it was manned only by those who had fought there and were bound to Fëanor. And as though it came at his call, there sprang up a wind from the northwest, and Fëanor slipped away secretly with all whom he deemed true to him, and went aboard and put out to sea, and left Fingolfin in Araman. And since the sea was there narrow, steering east and somewhat south, he passed over without loss, and first of all the Noldor set foot once more upon the shores of Middle-earth, and the landing of Fëanor was at the mouth of the firth that was called Drengist, and ran into Dorloman. We are encouraged here, I think, to see a certain recurring irony in the words and the deeds of Fëanor, that we are supposed to understand not just that he is falling further and further into shadow, or at least further and further from light, but that his own reasoning is beginning to become unstuck because of this fear of betrayal, because of this fear of treachery, because of his obsession with the Silmarils. Because you'll remember, when we first go to Alqualondë, long before, the day before the kinslaying occurs, he goes to the Teleri with two purposes. Yes, we want the boats. Yes, we want our kin to join us. He wants to enlarge his host to make the pursuit of Morgoth into Middle-earth easier. He wants a bigger army for facing down Morgoth. That's one of his justifications. The other half of that justification, of course, is that he will leave the Blessed Realm impoverished by the absence of the Teleri, right? He wants to take the Teleri from Valinor in order to strengthen himself and to diminish the beauty, the grandeur, the diversity, certainly, of Valinor itself. But here, just as we forgot that what he really cares about is Finwë because what he really cares about is the Silmarils, now we're getting this idea that he's not even pursuing Morgoth with the same kind of clarity, that he is letting these plans fall away, or that these plans are being eclipsed by things more urgent. We also get an interesting counterpoint here, that he does seek counsel, a thing for which Fëanor is not famous, right? We're told explicitly earlier that he rarely seeks counsel, that few have ever changed his path by counsel and none by force, right? That's what we're told. Well, here he seeks the counsel, but it's the counsel of his sons. It's the counsel of those who are closest to him in kin, those who are closest to him in mind. And we're going to explore some of those divisions as we move forward, but I absolutely see the point of comparison there. So Fëanor looks upon this situation, and despite having just told the envoy of the Valar, probably Mandos, despite having told Mandos how courageous the Noldor are, how courageous he personally is, that they would not give in to cowardice or to cravens or the fear of cravens, they sure do decide to not cross the Helcaraxe. Instead, they take to the boats in an act of betrayal. This is exactly the mechanism by which betrayal kind of perpetuates itself here, right? For fear of betrayal, they themselves betray. And that is how we end up, well, with the tragedies which are to come. This is ironic, not because you should be brave enough and reckless enough to undertake that which has been undertaken only by the Valar and Ungoliant, of course, but because we are going to see the crossing of the Helcaraxe in the pages to come. Fëanor is not going to do it, but others are going to do it, and they're going to demonstrate an even greater power. We'll get to that, in fact, because it's so phenomenally powerful when we do. But the point here is that we have taken the swan boats, we have set out, and we have crossed into Middle-earth. So now Fëanor and those closest to him, those he deems most true to him, are now safely back in Middle-earth. Many of them, most of them, all of them, question mark, for the first time, right? You'll remember that Fëanor was talking so eloquently about Cuivanen and the starlit skies above Middle-earth, despite having never been there himself, of course, because he is born in Valinor. We're going to get to the timeline in just a moment before we get into chapter 10, just to take a look at where we are, yeah. Let's move on, then, to see the real consequence of this, and another crime, perhaps, all the greater than those Fëanor has already committed because it is so unmotivated. But when they were landed, Maithros, the eldest of his sons, and Onatime, the friend of Fingon, ere Morgoth lies came between, spoke to Fëanor, saying, "Now what ships and rowers will you spare to return, and whom shall they bear hither first? Fingon, the valiant?" Then Fëanor laughed as one fey, and he cried, "None, and none! What I have left behind I count no loss. Needless baggage on the road it has proved. Let those that cursed my name curse me still, and wind their way back to the cages of the Valar. Let the ships burn." Then Maithros alone stood aside, but Fëanor caused fire to be set to the white ships of the Teleri. So in that place which was called Losgar, at the outlet of the Firth of Drengist, ended the fairest vessels that ever sailed the sea in a great burning, bright and terrible. And Fingolfin and his people saw the light afar off, red beneath the clouds, and they knew that they were betrayed. This was the first fruits of the kinslaying and the doom of the Noldor. So, for all of this, we see a desire from Fëanor to separate himself, yes, for fear of treachery, for fear of betrayal, but also a kind of general desire for retribution. He is blaming those around him, though they are at this point blameless, right? We just had the accounting that Fingolfin goes north with Feanor. After Finarfin turns back, Fingolfin stays with him because of his kinship and because of the oaths that they swore together, right? Fingolfin's oath in particular, the one that he took back in the Ring of Doom when he pledged, or actually not at the Ring of Doom, at Taniquetil in the halls of Manwë, where he pledges, half brother in blood am I, but full brother in heart. That's the oath that he's referring to. He has been faithful. He has continued to be faithful, and now he is separated from his kin. He is himself betrayed. But worse here, I think, is the burning of the boats. Because the burning of the boats accomplishes only one thing. It accomplishes a message to Fingolfin. It is the world's largest, fieriest raised middle digit back across the narrow straits just south of the Helcaraxa to Fingolfin and the rest of the Noldor on the far shore, who have accompanied Feanor, who believed in Feanor, who slayed their kin at Aqualonde and are now themselves stranded. And that's without acknowledging the destruction of one of these singular works of art, right? Again, Feanor is driven so far now into the shadow by his own his own desire for his Silmarils above all else, that he's becoming ruthless. As Galadriel points out, yes, exactly, he's becoming like Melkor. We're seeing that more and more clearly here, right? He is Spirit of Fire, indeed. The setting to flame of the boats, the swan boats of Aqualonde, is not of a completely different order than the taking down of the trees, the darkening of Valinor, right? The smote when Melkor smites the trunks of Taupirion and Laurelin, and the black sap runs forth, right? And Ungoliant feasts upon it. That is a singular act of destruction, in exactly the same way as the burning of the boats is a singular act of destruction, right? These things cannot be replicated. And it's the kind of thing that he himself protested when he said that he would not destroy the Silmarils, for his heart too would break. He's, sinking further and further into it. But now we're going to see a pivot. Now we're going to see something shift, and we're going to align a kind of conflict that is going to endure through the rest of this book, in fact. Then Fingolfin, seeing that Feanor had left him to perish in Ahriman or return in shame to Valinor, was filled with bitterness. And he desired now as never before to come by some way to Middle-earth and meet Feanor again. And he and his host wandered long in misery, but their valor and endurance grew with hardship, for they were a mighty people, the elder children undying of Eru Ilúvatar, but new come from the blessed realm, and not yet weary with the weariness of earth. The fire of their hearts was young, and led by Fingolfin and his sons, and by Finrod and Galadriel, they dared to pass into the bitterest north, and finding no other way, they endured at last the terror of the Helcaraxe and the cruel hills of ice. Few of the deeds of the Noldor thereafter surpassed that desperate crossing in hardihood or woe. There Elenwe, the wife of Turgon, was lost, and many others perished also. And it was with a lessened host that Fingolfin set foot at last upon the outer lands. Small love for Feanor or his sons had those that marched at last behind him and blew their trumpets in Middle-earth ere the first rising of the moon. I mean, we love Tolkien's imaginative use of language. We love the way that he coins all these neologistic terms. One of my favorite, moon, such an evocative piece of imagination there. Who knows what a moon could be? I'm sure we'll find out in the chapters to come. Foreshadowing such a brilliant kind of powerful reordering of the natural order of the world here. The actual physical geography and cosmology of Arda, just very casually here at the end of the sentence, when we're all feeling, I'm sure, this I don't know, a kind of fire, right? We're feeling fired up by Fingolfin and this great act, this great undertaking, the crossing of the Helcaraxe. Few of the deeds of the Noldor thereafter surpassed that desperate crossing in hardihood or woe. And they're young and they're powerful and they're vibrant. They're fresh from the blessed realm. They're still young in their hearts. Their fire is still bright, and they have not yet been diminished by the world. Which again, right? This was what I was referring to earlier when I was talking about this underlying idea that to be in the world is to be diminished by it, which, we'll have the opportunity to talk about continually as we move through these pages. Yeah. So this then is the end of chapter 9. We've got this idea of Feanor and his immediate kin now in Middle-earth, ready to pursue Morgoth, ready to pursue the Silmarils, of course. And right behind them, Fingolfin's crew, his remnant that is left here. Oh, I wanted to call out specifically the death of Elenwe, the wife of Turgon, who was curious and notable in that she was of the Vanyar, right? So you remember Finarfin's wife is of the Teleri, and Turgon's wife is of the Vanyar. And unfortunately, none of those make it back. None of those survive the crossing. So it is only the Noldor. It is only those elves of Noldor blood which make it back to Middle-earth, thus kind of fulfilling one of those categorical lines that we drew very early in the Silmarillion when we were, laying out what differentiates the Noldor from everyone else. Yeah. So Glorfin David's asking, so where did Elenwe, go? There, Elenwe, the wife of Turgon, was lost, and many others perished also. Presumably back to the halls of Mandos. Now, here's the real question. Are they bound by the doom of the Noldor that is laid in place by Mandos? Is it possible that Elenwe simply remains in the halls of Mandos forever? That the body is lost, presumably, right, in the grinding ice of the Helcaraxe, and her spirit, her Fea, goes to the halls of Mandos, where under normal circumstances it could be rehoused, rehomed, recorporated, and given form once more. Is she under the effects of this particular doom? How are we to differentiate, and how are we to interpret what happens to those who are lost or who are stranded or who have been betrayed by Feanor and his kin? We don't know. We don't get that information, I'm afraid to say. So we can speculate a little. I mean, it seems pretty clear that since she didn't turn around, since she didn't go back, since she didn't seek the forgiveness of the Valar, that the doom would be in place. But I don't know. It seems to me somewhat counterintuitive that there's no mechanism by which you could not seek the pardon of the Valar after death. But then we don't really know for sure if the Valar can meaningfully interact with the spirits in the halls of Mandos. We don't know yet whether the Valar can meaningfully interact with the halls, with the spirits waiting in the halls of Mandos. Yeah, I don't have a, glad Rebecca's calling out. She went to the halls of Mandos. It seems to be the case. Seems to be the case. Which, maybe we can say that that's an unfair fate. Maybe we can say that she absolutely deserved it because she took part in the slaying at Alqualande. We don't have enough information about, these individual things. The slaying at Alqualande is, we discussed last week the importance of these these hinted paratexts that are thought to exist out there in the fringes of the Legendarium that Tolkien himself never wrote, but kind of acknowledges, no, this story is important, thus it would have a story. I have not written that story, but it exists. And that's the kind of thing that we would want. We would want more information about what exactly happened to these borderline innocents, right? Who follow from kinship and from fealty. Difficult to parse, difficult to know even how we want to feel about that, honestly, particularly when we don't really know what the fate of those who await in the halls of Mandos is. Let's move on then to chapter 10 of the Sindar, and we're going to begin, of course, by rewinding just a couple thousand years. We're just going to go back a couple thousand years. I want to show you this slide just to lay out the timeline and where we are right now. Okay, so Mandos appearing to the Noldor, delivering the doom, everything that we've covered in the last chapter, in effect, takes place in 1495, the Vailian year 1495. Well, remember, each Vailian year, 9.5 of our years. Okay, so we are 14,500 years of history since the first flowering of Telperion and Laurelin and the beginning of the count of time. So we've got that long stretch, and then it's in 1133, the Vailian year 1133, that the Vanyar and the Noldor first arrive in Valinor. In 1150, Olwe leads most of the Teleri from Beleriand to Valinor upon Tol Eressëa. Remember, Ulmo takes Tol Eressëa back across the sea. They collect up the Teleri and take them all the way back to the Blessed Realm. Those that remain, those that were still looking for Elwe, for their king who had gone missing in a forest with Melian the Maya, they name themselves the Eglath the Forsaken. Then in 1152, Elwe and Melian emerge from the forest, and Elwe becomes king of all of the elves of Beleriand, basically. All of the other noble-born kings, all of those who previously held the title king, have either departed west, they have gone to the Blessed Realm, or there's still that one fragment, which we're going to learn a little more about in this week's reading, that one fragment led by Lenwe, who is still far east of the Ered Luin there. 1169, the Vailian year 1169, is the birth of Feanor. 1190 is the birth of Fingolfin. And then the year 1200 is the birth of Lúthien Tinúviel in Beleriand. We're going to learn about that in just a moment. Then 30 years after that, 30 Vailian years, right? Like the better part of a century after that is the birth of Finarfin. 200 Vailian years after the birth of Lúthien Tinúviel, 2,000 years in effect, Melkor is released. Shortly after that, Feanor crafts the Silmarils. He's then exiled to Formenos for drawing his sword on Fingolfin. And then in the year 1495, the two trees are destroyed. So this is like 3,500 years, more or less, give or take, of elven history in Valinor. It's roughly that long in terms of the timeline unfolding as we've seen it. And we are now going to rewind a decent chunk of that, right? We're going to rewind to the point at which the Noldor and the Vanyar have only been in Valinor for something, 70 years of the Vailian calendar, so something like 600 years of our, solar years, and the birth of Lúthien Tinúviel. This is how far back we're going. We've got a lot of history to get to. So, meanwhile, the Sindar. Now, as has been told, the power of Elwë and Melian increased in Middle-earth, and all the elves of Beleriand, from the mariners of Círdan to the wandering hunters of the Blue Mountains beyond the River Gallion, owned Elwë as their lord. Elu Thingol, he was called, King Greymantle in the tongue of his people. They were called the Sindar, the grey elves of starlit Beleriand, and although they were Morroquendi under the lordship of Thingol and the teaching of Melian, they became the fairest and the most wise and skillful of all the elves of Middle-earth. And at the end of the first age of the chaining of Melkor, when all the earth had peace and the glory of Valinor was at its noon, there came into the world Lúthien, the only child of Thingol and Melian. Though Middle-earth lay for the most part in the sleep of Yavanna, in Beleriand under the power of Melian there was life and joy, and the bright stars shone as silver fires. And there in the forest of Neldoreth, Lúthien was born, and the white flowers of Niflheidel came forth to greet her as stars from the earth. So meanwhile, in Middle-earth, Elwë and Melian wed now, right? Elwë has, I mentioned earlier that we were going to see a very purposeful shift from Quenya as the default elven language to Sindarin as the default elven language, and here it is, right? We're not going to talk about Elwë anymore. We're going to talk about Thingol. We're going to take his Sindarin name here, King Greymantle in the tongue of his people. The Grey Elves of starlit Beleriand, and although they were Morroquendi, except for Thingol himself, who is Calaquendi, because he went to Valinor in that first journey of that first ambassadorial journey, right, all the way to Valinor to check it out originally. He has seen the light, and of course, Melian is Maiar. She is a Maya. She is a Maya, and is profoundly powerful, right? So under these two things, the light of Valinor in the face of Elwë, in the face of Thingol, and the presence of Melian herself, these elves become the fairest and most wise and skillful of all the elves of Middle-earth. All the elves of Middle-earth, we will note here, a careful bit of distinguishing from the elves of Valinor and the Blessed Realm. Because this is a thing that Tolkien does a lot, and it is a thing that I think we want to pay attention to, but it is also a thing that has been mimicked by those who follow in the footsteps of Tolkien, those fantasy writers who have written throughout the 20th century, or the latter half of the 20th century, and have become somewhat less strict in their application. When Tolkien gives us a superlative, as he does not infrequently, it is always a considered and careful superlative. That is a product of spending 50 years working on this set of stories and understanding how these things fit together. When we're told that someone is the best and the brightest, it means the best and the brightest. We're not kidding. I don't think there are any instances of direct contradictions within the pages of any of the, well, I mean, different versions of the same story, right? Different versions as we move through the first and second phases of a lot of the background material that Christopher Tolkien assembles into the Silmarillion, absolutely, but less in direct kind of finished pieces, yeah. So we have Lúthien, who will be the fairest of all the elves of Middle-earth. And I want to call out, did I pull the... I did, excellent. So I want to pull out here, Lúthien, daughter of flowers. Literal translation there, daughter of flowers. And Tinúviel, of course, is nightingale, which you'll remember Melian taught to sing back in the gardens of Lórien in Valinor. Literally there, nightingale means daughter of twilight. So Lúthien Tinúviel, daughter of flowers, daughter of twilight. And when she is born, though Middle-earth lay for the most part in the sleep of Yavanna, right? You'll remember after the destruction of the lamps and the creation of Valinor, Yavanna goes back to Middle-earth and there puts all of the plants and animals to sleep because they can't survive without the light of the lamps at the time, and the light of the trees is never going to reach Middle-earth in the same way. So she puts everything to sleep. There are no flowers. Everything in Middle-earth is still green, as you recall. But here is an exception. There are little white flowers. These Nifredal came forth to greet her as stars from the earth. Stars from the earth there, you're also seeing the combination of the essence of Melian and the essence of Thingol, right? That the children of Iluvatar are of the earth, the elder children in particular. The elves are of the earth, and Melian is of some higher order of beings, right? This is interesting. Gladrebek is saying, are Feanor and the exiles now considered elves of Middle-earth? Yes, I would say so, yeah. Yeah, if you are in Middle-earth, then you are of Middle-earth. And that's, yeah, absolutely. The influence of the Blessed Realm in them will wane as they progress. But yes, I do think that Thingol is special. And we should note the categorical difference of going to Valinor and living with the Valar and marrying one of the Maiar. I think that's a very different kind of reflection. We don't get the account from those who have gone to Valinor. Well, I guess we do, but to a lesser extent, right? That Thingol has the light of Valinor in his face, partly from seeing the trees and partly from being very closely connected to Melian there, yes. Gladrebek is also asking, what do elves of Middle-earth eat if the plants are asleep? That's a great question. That's an absolutely great question. I have no idea. Do elves at this point in history need to eat? I mean, we can speculate that there is some hunting, I suppose. I'm thinking of the Teleri armed with their slender bows. I'm thinking of the fact that they have some kind of weapons which are distinct from the weapons which are crafted by first the Noldor, and we'll get to the Sindarin crafting of weapons in the pages to come too. I'm not sure. I don't know what the life cycle is or what the environment is even in Middle-earth at that point. It's a curious thing. I'm not sure that we get... Well, no, we do get the feast. We get the Feast of Yavanna in Valinor, so it does seem likely that... I don't know. Pass, Gladrebek, on that one, I'm afraid. I do want to show you, though, the Nifredil here, these flowers which emerge from bubbles. Tolkien associates these with snowdrops. In a later letter, he likens them to delicate snowdrops. And Nifredil does mean like little pallor or little paleness, so they probably are like snowdrops. And because snowdrops are not... native to the North American continent, I wanted to just drop pictures of them in here. These are extremely common where I come from, and they because they grow from bulbs, they grow very early in the spring and will oftentimes pop up through snow, thus snowdrops. And I'll show you the blanket of snowdrops that you will find in any forested area throughout the United Kingdom, basically, very early in the spring. So, snowdrops. So the birth of Lúthien is incredibly significant. But we're going to set her aside for just a little while as we move to kind of sketch the geographical and cultural landscape now of Beleriand and the passage of this frankly huge, dizzying amount of time between the birth of Lúthien and the return of the Noldor and the return of Melkor too. We'll get to all of that. So, it came to pass during the second age of the captivity of Melkor that dwarves came over the blue mountains of Ered Luin into Beleriand. Themselves they named Chazad, and the Sindar called them Naugrim, the stunted people, and Gunhirim, masters of stone. Far to the east were the most ancient dwellings of the Naugrim, but they had delved for themselves great halls and mansions after the manner of their kind in the eastern side of Ered Luin, and these cities were named in their own tongue Gabilgathol and Tumunzahar. In the north of the great height of Mount Golmet was Gabilgathol, which the elves interpreted in their tongue Belagost, that is, Mickelberg. And southward was delved Tumunzahar, by the elves named Nogrod, the Hollow Bold. Greatest of all the mansions of the dwarves was Khazad-dûm, the Dwarod elf, Hadrahand in the elvish tongue, that was afterwards in the days of its darkness called Moria. But it was far off in the mountains of mist beyond the wide leagues of Eriador, and to the Eldar came but as a name and a rumour from the words of the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. Yeah, Glorfin David says, oh, well, to Gladrebeki's point, how can plants be in the sleep of Yavanna while at the same time there's a forest at Neldoreth? Well, yes, I mean, there are forests. The idea is not that there are no plants. It's that the plants themselves are sleeping. That Yavanna has placed them in a state of suspended animation such that they do not die, such that they persist. It's notable that these snowdrops sprout with the birth of Lúthien because those may well be the first flowers that we see in Middle-earth at all, right? A direct product of Melion's influence. We credit that to Melion. So it isn't that Middle-earth is dead, or that Middle-earth has been scoured or scourged, right? It's not that there is no plant life. It's that the plant life there is not the full magnificence of the plant life that we see in Valinor, for example, right? Or that we will see in Middle-earth in later days. It is this dormant, this dormant green. I mean, the metaphor would be, I suppose, as Middle-earth now languishes under the starlit sky and has never yet seen the light of Valinor, that what we're seeing is like a forest at night. You can kind of imagine, I think, the stillness of the forest at night. You can imagine the flowers closed. You can imagine like the world sleeping. We're getting that the consonance there with this notion of the sleep of Yavanna. But the sleep of Yavanna was supposed to preserve the life of Middle-earth against death, I suppose, just in the absence of light, that she was going to suspend them, which is itself a really interesting prospect, because there doesn't seem to be a conception that light will return to Middle-earth, right? When the Pelori are raised and the trees are planted upon Zelahar, there's no sense that, and one day we're going to expand back. We're going to cast down the Pelori and we'll let the radiance shine out over Middle-earth, or we will, as I said last week, raise the trees on the highest slopes of Taniquetil and let the light shine forth that way. There's no concept, it seems to me. There does not seem to be like a working group among the Valar that is, okay, day 6,305,000 of trying to get light back to Middle-earth. How exactly are we going to do that? There doesn't seem to be any kind of push for that. So I struggle to parse exactly what Yavanna's response meant, exactly what it was supposed to accomplish ahead of the return of light to Middle-earth. We're told that the song back in the Ainulindale cuts out before the coming of man, so we're getting close to that point now. It's difficult to parse exactly what it means. What it does mean metaphorically is that Middle-earth has been sleeping, is that Middle-earth has been dormant all but in the absence of the Valar, that there is something missing from this light, and that it is through the terrible things that we're about to witness that good will come to be, that a greater joy will be visited upon Middle-earth in aggregate. This really speaks to the whole underlying question of whether or not the Valar were right to invite the elves to Valinor in the first place, and whether or not that is a thing that is in accord with the music. And that's a difficult prospect anyway, right? Because of the marring of Melkor, because of Melkor's casting down of the lamps and the fire flowing forth and the destruction that was experienced and was witnessed by the Valar then, and their, I don't know, unwillingness to take the risk, perhaps, their unwillingness to remain in Middle-earth, right? Do we see the retreat to Valinor as being something of great intention and purpose and protection? Is it something admirable? Is it something that we ought to applaud? Is their removal of the elves from Middle-earth a good thing? It's a difficult thing to wrap your head around, I think. It's a difficult thing to really build a comprehensive argument. We will remember that the Valar themselves are in disagreement. Ulmo believes that the elves ought not to be taken from Middle-earth. And maybe we can see a part of that argument manifesting here, right? Maybe we can see that had the elves remained in Middle-earth for the last, better part of 15,000 years, had the elves remained in Middle-earth, maybe things like Lúthien and the flowering of the snowdrops there, maybe that would have happened more often. Maybe they would, as Ulmo suggested, have helped to heal Middle-earth rather than taking their gifts and their skills and their presence from Middle-earth into Valinor in at least the largest part, right? We can do some kind of back-of-the-envelope mathematics to try and figure out how many elves stayed behind in Middle-earth, but it wasn't many, right? It's the largest part of each individual group definitely goes to Valinor. So it's a tough thing to figure out exactly how we are supposed to interpret this, and that's partly because, of course, it's simply a cosmological myth. It's an etiological myth. It's an accounting of the creation of the world in a way that is to some sense, in some sense, intended to be literally true, right? We are supposed to believe that these characters are real characters, that Olwe and Finwë and Feanor are real characters who had recognizable psychologies and kind of accomplished recognizable things in their lives, but also the world is flat and lit by 2 trees in the extreme west and mostly shrouded in darkness save for the stars of Varda. And how you reconcile that in terms of your physical understanding of what happened, of what day-to-day life looks like for the elves, I think you kind of have to just decide for yourself what feels absolutely literally true, what feels metaphorically true, and what things you're willing to speculate about and what things you yourself have to let go. I don't know that I genuinely struggle through all of this to remember that there's no light, to remember that it's just starlit. I have been able to do so through the long years of my reading of Tolkien, but it's not a thing that comes very naturally to me, is to understand the beauty of the starlit world as it's presented. We're going to get an opportunity to look at that a little in what is increasingly looking like it's going to be next week's reading, as we are here an hour into this week's session already. But yeah, I don't know. These are larger questions. This is partly, to pull back the veil a little bit, this is one of my intentions with the new Tolkien show, is to take a more topic-oriented approach so that we can really get into some of these questions and really talk about the entire legendarium in aggregate and kind of instead of moving chapter to chapter, which is so revealing in so many ways, but is also so limiting. If you want to do a review of something, if you want to do like a representative sample of how Tolkien approaches matters of creation, how Tolkien approaches matters of agriculture and farming and hunting and animal husbandry and things like that, just to pick 2 completely random topics, I think that it's going to be an interesting opportunity within that new show to look at those topics and explore broadly across the entire legendarium without getting bogged down into the nitpicking specifics of some of these arguments. To take a kind of broad aggregate approach to some of this material, I think would be really rewarding. But yeah, as we're moving through here, there's not a lot that we can say with confidence that we know for sure about the day-to-day lives of these elves, right? And this is true throughout the entire thing, I think. This is especially in Middle-earth, right? Because Middle-earth is supposed to be broadly where we live, right? Because there's still that compulsion. Though by this point, Tolkien has abandoned his kind of desire to very specifically, geographically tie the Silmarillion to the real modern world in terms of, actual, place names, actual cities, actual, recognizable pieces of geography. He's kind of given up on that by the time that we get the versions of the story that we see here in the Silmarillion. But it is still absolutely supposed to be our world. It is still supposed to be the deep history of our Earth. The men that come in this part of the story are going to be our forebears, are going to be our ancestors. So he's still trying to provide for us a mythology that is now, I think, less a mythology of England and Englishness and more a kind of comprehensive mythological foundation for those values which Tolkien particularly feels are valuable, while being broadly integratable, while being broadly, consonant with his own religious beliefs and his own philosophical beliefs too. So yeah, it's should we have more information about this? Yes, it would be great if we had more information about this. It would be great if we had. I mean, we can also parallel this with all the dwarven stuff that we're about to get in these chapters, which is almost nothing. We're going to get almost nothing on the dwarves because this is an elvish history. I would have loved more about the dwarves. I think the dwarves have an absolutely fascinating culture, but we don't know a lot about it. We get that Tolkienian maneuver. We get the some say, some have said, the wise report. We get these kind of allusions to stories told by other people, but not the content of the stories themselves, or any way of really integrating those stories with the legendarium as it's presented to us. Yeah. Yes, Galadriel is saying here, maybe her birth woke the flowers up. I think that's exactly it. Well, partly Melion's influence too, but yes, there is this idea that beauty begets beauty, right? We talked about this. When did we talk about this? We talked about this in terms of the fell influence of evil on its surroundings, right? That the presence of something evil will make that place worse. It will make that place grimmer and darker and more dangerous. And you know, I mentioned last time the desolation of Smaug being a perfect example of that. There's no reason that the area surrounding Erebor should be desolate. In fact, it's explicitly not desolate prior to the arrival of Smaug, but then it becomes desolate because of the presence of the dragon. And here, I think we're absolutely seeing the inverse of that. I think that's a real... I think that is, in terms of Tolkien's like philosophical schematic, in terms of things J.R.R. Tolkien believed in his heart to be true, I think that is one you can put your back up against. I think that he believes that beauty begets beauty. I think that we see often and over again the ways in which a singular beauty can expand out to elevate an entire community, an entire region. I mean, that's very much what we're going to be talking about with, you know, the girdle of Melian. We're going to be talking about how Thingol's kingdom is protected here by the power and the beauty of Melian. And I'm saying this, I always want to hesitate here because of the gendering of beauty so often in Tolkien's work to a certain extent, though Tolkien will apprehend the beauty in most anything given the opportunity, but in fantasy work more generally. And the fact that beauty as a virtue is so often associated with the female characters that we're given, the few female characters that we're given in Tolkien's Legendarium. And I don't think that this is to suggest that the great virtue or the solitary virtue of women is beauty. We've talked about this a little before, but many of the greatest characters in the entire Legendarium, many of the characters who are most admirable, who are most virtuous, who we ought to seek to emulate the most are women, are female, right? I'm thinking of Yavanna, I'm thinking of Varda, I'm absolutely thinking, you know, even the other Valar that we don't get so much time with, right? I've been thinking a lot about Estate lately. Nienna is an absolute powerhouse of philosophical implication. What we are supposed to take from Tolkien's sense of the world just by the existence of Nienna, never mind the albeit very few actions that she takes in the pages of the Silmarillion. It is a way of situating women as being absolutely central to our experience and central to what is virtuous about our experience. But yes, I mean, it is fair to say that we are withheld from them because many of the most active actors, many of the most active characters in our stories, certainly many of the POV characters in our stories are men. But that is to me kind of the same distinction as the elf and dwarf distinction that we were just talking about, right? We don't know anything about the dwarves because our stories come from the elves. We don't know a lot about the internal lives of the women of Middle Earth, and of Arda. I can expand this out as wide as you like, right? This is true of the hobbits, of the men, of the elves, of the dwarves, very specifically of the dwarves, of course, of, you know, the Maiar, yes, absolutely, of the Valar, yes, absolutely. We don't know because we're being told largely stories about men by men, which is not to suggest that you know, Tolkien thought that those were the only stories worth telling. It is an absolutely notable feature of Tolkien's texts that basically every time we see a marriage, every time we explore a romantic relationship, right? Tolkien, not particularly given to interests in romance, certainly not given to interests in sex within the pages of these books, right? Very kind of, very chaste and chivalrous texts are Tolkien's works. But every time we see a significant marriage, it is almost always a kind of deserving dude with a vastly more deserving woman. That is, you know, it's Beren and Lúthien, it's Aragorn and Arwen, it's Sam and Rosie Cotton, you know, it's all of them all across the board. I'm being a little disingenuous there, but you know, Sam maybe is is Sam the greatest exception to that? Because by that point, I guess he's not the mayor yet. He's on track to be the mayor, though. I would need to think about that. Sam may be the most deserving man with the least deserving wife, if that makes sense. Not to suggest in any way that Rosie is undeserving of Sam. We would never say that. But the disparity there is perhaps the least of all the possible marriages that we see in the works of Tolkien in the case of Sam and Rosie Cotton at the end of The Lord of the Rings. Possibly. And here, of course, we're getting the foreshadowing of all of those relationships with Thingol and Melian, with Elwë, as was, and Melian here, because though we think of the elves as being special, powerful creatures of legend and lore, right? There is as much space between the elves and the Maiar as there is between the man and the elves, right? It's just the same as Beren and Lúthien. It's not just the same. It's maybe even bigger, honestly. Beren and Lúthien and Thingol and Malian, for sure. Let's get back to, I've taken such a tangent here. I've forgotten even where we were. Yes, let's get back to our slide here, and we'll take a look at some of these names. This is really the point, as I say, that we're pivoting from the Quenya to the Sindarin here, right? The names of the dwarves of the dwarven cities here are given to us 3 times. They're given to us in first in Khuzdul, first in the dwarven language, then in Sindarin, and then in English as well, right? So though it is an archaic kind of English, it's not immediately striking to the modern ear as being English, right? Gabilgathol, which the elves interpreted in their own tongue. Belagost, that is Mickelberg. So we get it. Gabilgathol is the Chuzud, that's the dwarven there. And Chuzdul, excuse me, the dwarven there. Then Belagost, the elven, and then Mickelberg, which is the English translation. It's an archaic English translation. I'm actually more familiar with it because Mickle is a word that persists in colloquial idiomatic Scottish English, more so than in the English used in England. But yes, all of these mean the same thing, which is basically big city, great city. That's essentially where we are. Tamanzahar and Hollowbold mean hollow dwelling or hollow home. Nogrod here is something slightly different. It's more like dwarf cave, right? And then we get the legendary Khazad-dûm. We get the Dwaro Delph and Hathodrond in the Elvish tongue, which means like a vaulted cavern, a cavern with a large vaulted ceiling. What's most interesting, of course, about this slide is the lack of pomp and circumstance, the lack of fanfare with the arrival of the dwarves. So we come into this chapter with a very brief, obviously this happened long ago, and then there was Lúthien, and that's great. But now also dwarves. It came to pass during the second age of the captivity of Melkor that dwarves came over the Blue Mountains of Ered Luin into Beleriand. We don't know where they came from. We don't know how they woke. We don't know how they learned their crafts. We don't know how their societies are structured. We don't know really anything about what dwarven culture is. We get some notes here on their language. We're going to get a few more things, like the fact that they are somewhat reluctant to teach their own language, but very eager to learn the languages of others, that they are going to be traders, that they have some skill already with their craft, with their, Aule-inspired crafts. Yeah. Glad Rebecca's saying, I love the fancy words that turn out to be very mundane in their own languages. I mean, that is just the Tolkien trick, isn't it? Everything is just a very straightforward name. And that's one of the great things about this pivot to Sindarin that we're observing in this chapter, is that as readers of The Lord of the Rings, many of these terms are now going to start becoming more familiar, right? We are getting here Khazad-dûm, of course, and we're getting, in the days of its darkness, called Moria. Oh, that sounds familiar. Yes, the mountains of mist beyond the wide leagues of Eriador. Oh, the misty mountains, right? Beyond Eriador. We get it. We've got these things now. But we're also getting specific language segments, language stubs. We're getting words that we're beginning to understand. In fact, let's move on to the next slide, because I think this is where we get some specific examples. From Nogrod and Belagost, the Naugrim came forth into Beleriand, and the elves were filled with amazement, for they had believed themselves to be the only living things in Middle-earth that spoke with words or wrought with hands, and that all others were but birds and beasts. But they could understand no word of the tongue of the Naugrim, which to their ears was cumbrous and unlovely, and few ever of the Eldar have achieved the mastery of it. But the dwarves were swift to learn, and indeed were more willing to learn the elven tongue than to teach their own to those of an alien race. Few of the Eldar went ever to Nogrod and Belagost, save Eol of Nan Elmoth and Maiglan his son, but the dwarves trafficked into Beleriand, and they made a great road that passed under the shoulders of Mount Dolmed and followed the course of the river Ascar, crossing Gallion at Sarn Athrad, the ford of stones, where battle after befell. Ever cool was the friendship between the Naugrim and the Eldar, though much profit they had one of the other. But at that time those griefs that lay between them had not yet come to pass, and King Thingol welcomed them. But the Naugrim gave their friendship more readily to the Noldor in after days than to the others of elves and men, because of their love and reverence for Aule, and the gems of the Noldor they praised above all other wealth. In the darkness of Arda already the dwarves wrought great works, for even from the first days of their fathers they had marvellous skill with metals and with stone, but in that ancient time iron and copper they loved to work, rather than silver or gold. Glorfin David's asking, is there any connection between the words doom in the English and doom with that diacritical mark in the Dwarvish? No. I mean, yes, obviously phonetically, right? Homophonically, yes. But no substantial etymological distinction there. This is doom in that instance. I'm sure that Tolkien enjoyed the play of the word. Khazad-dûm has this enormous power, particularly when we're at Moria, right? And we're getting the sense of the doom that befell the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. This to me, though, is another Tyrion upon Tuna. It's another example of these, or another Endor, right? Another just, when you are working with a fairly limited set of phonetic building blocks, you are inevitably going to come up with the same words that other people have come up with, or the same sounds that other people have come up with. But yeah, I don't think that there's anything etymological happening there, but it is a really pleasant and poetic kind of resonance to Khazad-dûm. So, here we get a brief insight into the character of our dwarves. From Nogrod and Belagos, the Naugrim came forth into Beleriand, and the elves were filled with amazement, for they had believed themselves to be the only living things in Middle-earth that spoke with words or wrought with hands, and that all others were but birds and beasts, because we must remember, they don't know of the coming of man. They don't know there is another order of being about to arrive in Middle-earth, because the Valar never told the elves that that was happening. At this point, in fact, even the elves in Valinor don't know about the man, because that only happens after Melkor has been released from his long imprisonment and he goes to the Noldor and starts gossip. He starts telling them stories about, the Valar never mentioned the second children of Iluvatar. That's weird. I wonder why they would keep that secret from you guys, their most beloved friends. That seems suspicious to me. I don't know. Seems sus. Seems definitely sus. But the elves still in Middle-earth have no idea that there are other beings out there besides themselves and the Valar, of course, who can speak, right? You'll remember the first naming of the elves themselves is because they themselves can't speak or craft things with their hands. But they could understand no word of the tongue of the Naugrim, which to their ears was cumbrous and unlovely. And yeah, you got to feel a little bit bad for the dwarves, right? This is where the elven perspective of this document really kind of shows up, right? They are the Naugrim, they are the stunted people, and their words are cumbrous and unlovely. Cumbrous there is just an archaic form of the word cumbersome, so just awkward, like ill-fitting, ill-suiting, cumbrous and unlovely. Few ever of the Eldar have achieved the mastery of it, but that's okay, because the dwarves are very happy to learn the elven tongues and to learn the elven customs. Few of the Eldar ever went to Nogrod and Belagos, and here we're getting some of that foreshadowing too, right? Save Eol of Nan-Almoth and Maeglin, his son, and then we get, they cross Galleon at Sarin Athrad, the Ford of Stones, where battle after befell. We don't know that battle yet. We haven't had that battle yet, but we will get to it, yeah. Let me see here. Excellent. Okay, so we can move on from here, I think. I'm looking nervously at the time. I'm wondering if my bold plan to even make it through a chapter and a half is now all for rack and ruin, but we'll see. Let's move on to get to the wisdom, then, of Melian. Now, Melian had much foresight after the manner of the Maiar, and when the second age of the captivity of Melkor had passed, she counselled Thingol that the peace of Arda would not last forever. He took thought, therefore, how he would make for himself a kingly dwelling, and a place that should be strong if evil were to awake again in Middle-earth. And he sought aid and counsel of the dwarves of Belagos. They gave it willingly, for they were unwearied in these days and eager for new works. And though the dwarves ever demanded a price for all that they did, whether with delight or with toil, at this time they held themselves paid. For Melian taught them much that they were eager to learn, and Thingol rewarded them with many fair pearls. These Círdan gave to him, for they were got in great number in the shallow waters around the Isle of Balor, and the Naugrim had not before seen their like, and they held them dear. One there was as great as a dove's egg, and its sheen was as starlight on the foam of the sea. Nymphalos it was named, and the chieftain of the dwarves of Belagos prized it above a mountain of wealth. Therefore the Naugrim laboured long and gladly for Thingol, and devised for him mansions after the fashion of their people, delved deep into the earth. Where the Escalduin flowed down and parted Neldoreth from Rhegion, there rose in the midst of the forest a rocky hill, and the river ran at its feet. There they made the gates of the hall of Thingol, and they built a bridge of stone over the river, by which alone the gates could be entered. Beyond the gates wide passages ran down to high halls and chambers far below that were hewn in the living stone, so many and so great that the dwelling was named Menegroth, the 1,000 Caves. So, the dwarves are put to purpose because Melian has, has much foresight. I was hesitating. Should I use the word foresight? Well, yes, I should probably use the word foresight, given that that's the word right there on the page. Melian had much foresight after the manner of the Maiar. What is the manner of the foresight of the Maiar? Well, that's a really interesting question, right? Because we might be tempted to associate it with a memory of the music. Remember, the Maiar are all Ainur. They were all there for the singing of the music in the first place, and all witnessed the vision of the creation of Ea prior to its actual creation, prior to that actual moment of intervention from Ilúvatar. Is that what Melian is accessing here? She has a memory of the things that she has seen that will come to pass? Well, possibly, but possibly not, because of the marring of Melkor. We don't know now how much the world that we are experiencing matches the music and matches the vision that was created, because the marring of Melkor is this ongoing and present phenomenon. I'm inclined to think that she is sensing some part or is remembering some part of the song, but it is also possible that there is some greater kind of prophecy. It's a skill or a talent, a quirk, a quality that we do associate with not just the Valar, not just the Valar and the Maiar, but with the good and the great of Tolkien's world. Yeah. Yes, so glad you're back. You're saying, so Thingol and Melian moved underground. They sure did. Yes, Menegroth, the 1,000 caves, they're largely existing underground. In fact, what do I want to call it here? Because I really want to move on to the next slide so that we can talk a little bit more about Menegroth itself. We will just note the paying of the dwarves, who always want to be paid, whether they undertake the works with delight or with toil, right? Whether they are eager to work or less eager to work, they always want to be paid. They want there to be like a proper recompense, which you'll remember from Ale, right? Though he gives the things of his creation away freely, he loves the praise of them. And I think that we can see something connected there between Ale's character, his personality, and the dwarves of his creation. So Melian teaches them much that they are eager to learn, and Thingol rewards them with many fair pearls that Círdan gives to him, for they are got in great number in the shallow waters around the Isle of Balar. The Isle of Balar, you'll remember, is out in the Bay of Balar. It is that stub of Tol Eressëa that was left behind when Ulmo lifted the island to take it across to Valinor the first time. That's where the Isle of Balar is. In fact, we're going to take a look at a map in just a moment, and we'll see how we're looking there. Yeah. So Thingol decides to create this safe place, a place that can be protected, a place that is secure against the possibility that evil will ever arise in Middle-earth, and it is created along with the dwarves, and thus, because it is created along with the dwarves, it is something very special indeed. Let's take a look. But the elves also had part in that labor, and elves and dwarves together, each with their own skill, there wrought out the visions of Melian, images of the wonder and beauty of Valinor beyond the sea. The pillars of Menegroth were hewn in the likeness of the beeches of Orome, stalk, bough, and leaf, and they were lit with lanterns of gold. The nightingales sang there as in the gardens of Lórien, and there were fountains of silver, and basins of marble, and floors of many-coloured stones. Carven figures of beasts and birds there ran upon the walls, or climbed upon the pillars, or peered among the branches entwined with many flowers. And as the years passed, Melian and her maidens filled the halls with woven hangings, wherein could be read the deeds of the Valar, and many things that had befallen in Arda since its beginning, and shadows of things that were yet to be. That was the fairest dwelling of any king that has ever been east of the sea. And when the building of Menegroth was achieved, and there was peace in the realm of Thingol and Melian, the Naugrim yet came ever and anon over the mountains, and went in traffic about the lands. But they went seldom to the Falas, for they hated the sound of the sea and feared to look upon it. To Beleriand there came no other rumour or tidings of the world without. So we craft this subterranean wonderland. We craft this series of caves, right? The 1,000 caves, and we fill it then with all of these images of beauty and wonder, the elves and dwarves together. And what is the product of this combined work? What is the product of this combined artistry? That was the fairest dwelling of any king that has ever been east of the sea. Again, one of those declamatory, superlative statements that Tolkien absolutely means 100%. In Middle-earth, there has never been a place as fair as Menegroth, because the elves and the dwarves worked together. Because we're seeing again that desire for consonance and harmony, which goes all the way back to the music of the Ainulindalë, that goes back to this idea that when we comprehend each ourselves only our own little part, then there is paucity, there is poverty. And instead, we find richness in the mingling of many voices, the skilled toil here of many hands, right? We're creating this palace, which is itself beautiful, yes, but which I think Galadriel is pointing this out in the chat here. Yes, yeah, I never quite got this since elves seem so fond of starlight. I thought they didn't like underground places. they don't like underground places in the way that dwarves like underground places. Certainly the descriptions that we get here, right? These huge, broad caverns with the carved trees and all the little statues of birds and animals, nightingales singing as in the gardens of Lúthien, right? You'll remember that that's where Melian kind of did her Maiar internship back in Valinor. She used to work in the gardens of Lúthien, and work is such a weird word for the Maiar, right? She was present in the gardens of Lúthien and taught the nightingales to sing first, right? That's why they are present here. That's why they're always associated with her. This is a thing of great beauty. Yes, the fairest dwelling of any king that has ever been east of the sea. But you're absolutely right, Galadriel Becky, because it is a kind of counterposition to what the elves naturally, it would seem to us, are. When they awake at Cuivanen, they are thrilled to be beneath the starlit sky. And we're told that Varda is esteemed above all others by elves because of the light of the stars that she created. And here, we're replacing the light of the stars with these artificial torches. And why are we doing that? We're doing that because of the threat of discord, because of the threat of danger, because of the threat of violence and the return of evil to Middle-earth. So we are guarding ourselves. And I think it's entirely possible to see that desire for security as being something that is pretty antithetical to what elves should be, to how the world should be, that the product of violence itself is a consequence of Melkor, is a consequence of the marring of Arda from the first. I think that we're seeing here, for all that we can celebrate this wonderful place, bedecked with tapestries telling the history of the Valar and the shadows of things that are yet to be, this amazing, beautiful place that is still itself beautiful, but is perhaps, yes, significant in that it is a product of a world that is imperfect, a product of a world that we ought not to celebrate directly, a product of a circumstance that would be nobody's first choice, And then we get this note here at the end, again, kind of tying into this idea of being disconnected from those around you rather than appropriately connected. As we see here, the product of elven and dwarven hands working together, elven and dwarven spirits working together, we get the counterpoint. When the building of Managroth was achieved, there was peace in the realm of Thingol and Melian. The now grim yet came over and anon to the mountains and went in traffic about the lands, but they went sullen to the Falas, for they hated the sound of the sea and feared to look upon it. Well, remember back in chapter 2 when Yavanna's talking about the creation of the dwarves, and that because Aule created them by himself, they will bear no love for her children and the things of her make. And the same seems to be true here for those things which belong to Ulmo, right? One of the things that makes the elves so special is that they belong to the earth and the air and the stars and the sea. They are given this broad remit, this broad portfolio of engagement with Middle-earth. They get to apprehend the fullness of it. But because Aule creates the dwarves on his own, it seems sadly that they do have a more diminished perspective on Middle-earth itself. Their ability to find the joy and the beauty in things is less innate, is less immediate than it would be for the children of Ilúvatar, right? And I'm talking about the elves, of course, being created in concert by all of the Valar. Of course, the elves are the children of Ilúvatar specifically, but Ilúvatar being the unification of all of the Ainur, right? Of embodying and possessing all of the various qualities of the Ainur. I think we can kind of make that connection, kind of make that argument at least. Certainly, Menegroth sounds amazing. And yes, when you think about this unambiguous superlative here, the fairest dwelling of any kind that has ever, of any king, that has ever been east of the sea, and you think of, Gondolin and Rivendell to a certain extent, and Lothlorien, right? This is somewhere very special indeed. It also reminds me of the depiction of Thranduil's halls that we get in the movie adaptation of The Hobbits. I think that we're clearly, I'm thinking of the carven trees that we get there, and I'm thinking there's something resonant there too. Okay, let's keep pushing on, because peace is not going to last. We are hearing word of fell beasts in the east. But as the third age of the captivity of Melkor drew on, the dwarves became troubled, and they spoke to King Thingol, saying that the Valar had not rooted out utterly the evils of the north, and now the remnant, having long multiplied in the dark, were coming forth once more and roaming far and wide. They are fell beasts, they said, in the land east of the mountains, and your ancient kindred that dwell there are flying from the plains to the hills. And ere long the evil creatures came even to Beleriand, over passes in the mountains, or up from the south through the dark forests. Wolves there were, or creatures that walked in wolf shape, and other fell beings of shadow, and among them were the orcs, who afterwards wrought ruin in Beleriand, and they were yet few and wary, and did but smell out the ways of the land, awaiting the return of their lord. Whence they came, or what they were, the elves knew not then, thinking them perhaps to be Avari, who had become evil and savage in the wild, in which they guessed all too near, it is said. So again, we're getting an echo here of the ongoing perplexity regarding the creation of orcs. The elves don't know what the orcs are, but they kind of recognize them. They think that they could be the Avari. The Avari, of course, are those who refuse to undertake the journey to Valinor in the first place. All the elves of Beleriand traveled from Cuivanen all the way across Eriador, all the way into Beleriand over the Blue Mountains there. But the Avari are the ones who did not go, and maybe that's where orcs came from, and that is, a version of the story. The part that the elves are missing out here is the taking of the Avari and the twisting them, the perverting them into orcish form. So the dwarves are now where Orome perhaps is coming no longer to Middle Earth, is coming no longer to valiantly ride out and slay the monsters. And it's falling to the elves, to the dwarves, to deal with them. Your ancient kindred that dwell there are flying from plains to the hills. That would be, the Avari and those elves of Lenwë who are about to come into Beleriand and kind of reunite those two disparate branches of the elven family tree, which we'll get to in just a second. So what do we do in response to this? Well, we craft weapons. And we want to distinguish this, I think, a little from the crafting of weapons of the Noldor. We are given cause to believe that the crafting of weapons by the Noldor in Valinor is a troubling thing, that it is an evil thing, that it is a thing of which we ought to be, at the very least, extremely suspicious and extremely perturbed by. But the crafting of weapons here by the Sindarin is categorically different. And the reason for that is, of course, that there is no threat to the Noldor of Valinor from without. That the only purpose that a weapon can serve there is internal dissent and internal conflict. Here, Thingol is arming his people in order to respond to this increasing threat from the monsters, the host of Melkor. And that does give us an insight to Professor Tolkien's approach to violence, Professor Tolkien's approach to the arts of warfare, I suppose, and the need to secure oneself. Acknowledging that the need to secure oneself is proof of a fallen world, right? Is proof of the fact that the world itself is marred, that the world itself is imperfect, because if the world were not marred, we would have no violence in the first place, and thus no need of weapons even to defend ourselves. But here, well, we have to make do. We have to do the best that we can. Let's take a look at these weapons of the Sindar. Therefore Thingol took thought for arms, which before his people had not needed, and these at first the Naugrim smithied for him, for they were greatly skilled in such work, though none among them surpassed the craftsmen of Nogrod, of whom Telkar the smith was greatest in renown. A warlike race of old were all the Naugrim, for they would fight fiercely against whomsoever aggrieved them, servants of Melkor, or Eldar, or Avari, or wild beasts, or not seldom their own kin, dwarves of other mansions and lordships. Their smithcraft indeed the Sindar soon learned of them, yet in the tempering of steel alone, of all the crafts the dwarves were never outmatched, even by the Noldor, and in the making of mail of linked rings, which was first contrived by the smiths of Belegost, their work had no rival. At this time, therefore, the Sindar were well armed, and they drove off all creatures of evil, and had peace again. But Thingol's armories were stored with axes and spears and swords, and tall helms and long coats of bright mail, for the hauberks of the dwarves were so fashioned that they rusted not, but shone ever as if they were new burnished. And that proved well for Thingol in the time that was to come. So we have monsters on our borders. We go to our buddies the dwarves and say, teach us how to make weapons. You have weapons because, wow, you're a quarrelsome lot, aren't you? So they craft these weapons for the elves, and they are put to use, securing the elven kingdom once again, and then they are put aside because they do not rust. They do not fall from use. And this is another perspective, I think, on Tolkien's thoughts on violence and on the machineries of war. This is, of course, very different from the kinds of machineries that he himself was experiencing in the First World War and that was so concerned with in the Second World War and in the middle part of the 20th century. But still, the underlying mechanism is the same. This is the argument of turning swords into plowshares, right? Once you have a weapon, that weapon is going to endure, and it is always going to be a weapon, because the thing about weapons is that they aren't anything else. They aren't tools. We're going to talk in the very near future, when I finish up my podcast series There and Back Again, when I finish discussing The Lord of the Rings and talk about the scouring of the Shire, we're going to talk about the ways that the hobbits themselves are armed versus the ways that the outsiders to the Shire are armed, and kind of distinguishing between the two utilities of tools and weapons. But we see that here too. We have now axes and spears and swords and tall helms and long coats of bright mail, the kind of mail that the dwarves will never be surpassed in the creation of. The dwarves are still going to have this particular skill that is themselves, is to themselves the strongest. Oh, I wanted to offer a quick trivia question here. Telkar the Smith, greatest in renown? Telkar the Smith, does that sound familiar to you at all? We'll circle back to that in a moment. So the warlike race of old were the Naugrim, and they would fight fiercely against whomsoever agreed them. Servants of Melkor, okay, check, that seems appropriate. Or Eldar, okay, that's less good. Are we learning at this point that there have already been conflicts, armed conflicts, between the dwarves and the elves, presumably of Landway to the east of Beleriand? Or Avari? Okay, again, question, how far have the Avari wandered then that they are now in proximity to the dwarves? Or is this just a general thought that, well, these are all the categories of beings that we know exist in Middle-earth right now, and the dwarves have beef with all of them? Or wild beasts, and this is crucial, or not seldom their own kin, dwarves of other mansions and lordships. How is this distinct from the kinslaying at Alqualande? A great sin, a great, like almost, and I'm using this phrase very carefully and explicitly, almost an original sin, right? The slaying of the Teleri at Alqualande is one of the breaking points in the history of the elves. It is one of the points at which, or one of the points by which we can really navigate the history of Arda in its totality, right? It is one of the darkest days that there has ever or will ever be. But here we're told quite casually, oh yeah, the dwarves fight amongst themselves all the time. Now, presumably to the death. I mean, I can't imagine, we're armed with swords here. We're armed with axes and spears and swords and tall helms and long coats of bright. There's no reason to believe that the dwarves are not killing each other. Why then is it categorically different for the dwarves to kill their own kin, right? To kill dwarves of other mansions and lordships, but kin nonetheless. And why is that categorically different from the elves? And we have to kind of come to this ongoing question about the dwarves' reality, I suppose, for want of a better word, the dwarves' life. And what it means to have the life granted them by Iluvatar that is still of a different order than the life granted to the children of Iluvatar, right? You'll remember Iluvatar, when he's talking to Aule, talks about the children of his own make and his adoption. That the dwarves are still perhaps different. It's a difficult question to answer. It's a question that kind of resists even a careful reading, because aesthetically, as we move through, particularly The Lord of the Rings, and to some extent The Hobbit too, but The Hobbit is in such a more fantastical rhetorical mode that it's easier to kind of take it as a fantasy story, even within a fantasy story, I guess. But reading The Lord of the Rings, we want, I think, these dwarves to have Fea. We want these dwarves to have souls. We want these dwarves to be as fully realized and rounded as any of the other characters, as any of the elves or the men. But then we get details like this that give me pause and make me want to question. Your time is up on the trivia question, by the way. Telkar is name-checked in The Lord of the Rings, because Telkar is the dwarven smith who writes Narsil, the white-red flame. It passes eventually to Elendil, who is reforged into Anduril, Flame of the West, wielded by Aragorn. I've got the slide. I hesitate there because I'm struggling to pull up this slide for you. From chapter 6 of book 3, the first half of The Two Towers, this is when Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and Gandalf go to Medusel. They go to the Golden Hall of the Rohirrim in Edoras, and we get this quote here. Slowly Aragorn unbuckled his belt and himself set his sword upright against the wall. Here I set it, he said, but I command you not to touch it, nor to permit any other to lay hand on it. In this elvish sheath dwells the blade that was broken and has been made again. Telkar first wrought it in the deeps of time. Death shall come to any man that draws Elendil's sword save Elendil's heir. The guard stepped back and looked with amazement on Aragorn. It seems that you are come on the wings of song out of forgotten days, he said. It shall be, Lord, as you command. Aragorn's pretty great, you guys. I don't know if that's a really unusual perspective or a really unusual opinion, but wow. Aragorn just kind of rules. So what I want to do right now, if I can do this somewhat carefully, somewhat skillfully, and somewhat without completely losing the track of the conversation, is to share with you this glimpse of the interactive map over at lotrproject.com. As I have said before, this is the place to go to check out this fantastic interactive map of, in this instance, Beleriand, because I wanted to show you roughly how we're dealing with the geography here. I'm going to pull out just a little so that you can see all of Beleriand. You can see the Falas on the coast here. You can see we're actually a little bit north of the Bay of Valar and the Isle of Valar that remains from Tol Eressëa. You can see here Doriath. This is where we're going to be spending a lot of our time here. You can see up here in the northwest Lamoth, that is where Melkor roared such that it awoke the Balrogs in Angband who came forth. The Firth of Drengist, here you can see this is where Feanor lands and comes into Dorloman. You remember we discussed that in the end of the last chapter. There are lots of places that we can see here that will be significant, and a few that don't yet exist. Gondolin, I'm looking at you. Angband, for those of you keeping track at home, is far to the north of this. Well, actually, not very far to the north. Just off the northern edge of this map is where Angband is, where Melkor currently resides from where we are in our progression, right? From the arrival of Feanor in Middle-earth, that's where Morgoth is. As of our point right now, he, of course, is still in Valinor, just about to be released and causing a lot of trouble. But I wanted to call out here the Ered Luin here on the eastern edge of Beleriand. You can see Belagost and Nogrod here with the dwarf road coming down to Sarn Athrad, as we mentioned earlier. And then over here in the middle of Menegroth on the river Isgaldwin, between the Forest of Naldoreth and the Forest of Region, here is Menegroth, the capital of Thingol's kingdom. So just to kind of put some of these things in perspective, Nan Elmoth here, the forest on the Callan River that we'll note, is where Elwë, as was, Thingol as was, met with Melian for the first time. So this is where we are. We're also in a moment going to be talking about Assyrian. We're going to be talking about this stretch here in the shadow of the mountains, although the mountains are not casting a shadow right now except by starlight. So we'll talk about that too, I guess, as we get there. But yeah, this is Assyrian down here, which we'll talk about in due course. So that is the fantastic LOTR project, which again, I recommend. The link to that will be, as ever, in the show notes. They're just a fantastic resource. If you have a dollar to throw to LOTR project, they have this fantastic project about word frequency in all of Tolkien's works too. It's a great spot for word nerds. If you're inclined to be nerdy about Tolkien, as you're sitting here listening to to this podcast, then definitely check it out. I'm so sorry. I'm having trouble getting back to my other slide here so that we can continue on. Yes, here we are. Now we're going to pick up with our the other community of elves, the other population of elves. Now, as has been told, one Lenwë of the host of Olwë forsook the march of the Eldar at that time when the Teleri were halted by the shores of the great river upon the borders of the westlands of Middle-earth. Little is known of the wanderings of the Nandor, whom he led away down Anduin. Some, it is said, dwelt age-long in the woods of the vale of the great river. Some came at last to its mouths and there dwelt by the sea, and yet others, passing by Ered Nimrais, the White Mountains, came north again and entered the wilderness of Eriador between Ered Luin and the far mountains of Mist. Now these were a woodland people and had no weapons of steel, and the coming of the fell beasts of the north filled them with great fear, as the Naugrim declared to King Thengel in Menegroth. Therefore Denethor, the son of Lenwë, hearing rumour of the might of Thingol and his majesty, and of the peace of his realm, gathered such host of his scattered people as he could, and led them over the mountains into Beleriand. There they were welcomed by Thingol, as kin long lost that return, and they dwelt in Assyriand, the land of 7 rivers. Of the long years of peace that followed after the coming of Denethor there is little tale. In those days, it is said, Daeron, the minstrel, chief lore-master of the kingdom of Thingol, devised his runes, and the Naugrim that came to Thingol learned them, and were well pleased with the device, esteeming Daeron's skill higher than did the Sindar, his own people. By the Naugrim, the Kurth were taken east over the mountains and passed into the knowledge of many peoples, but they were little used by the Sindar for the keeping of records until the days of the war, and much that was held in memory perished in the ruins of Doriath. But for bliss and glad life, there is little to be sad before it ends. As works fair and wonderful, while still they endure for eyes to see, are their own record, and only when they are in peril or broken forever do they pass into song. So, the coming of the Nandor, one of those spurs of the Elven diaspora west that has been long forgotten. They really did just disappear from the text for a good long while. But now, with the coming of the fell beasts of Morgoth back into Middle-earth, they flee west. They come under the command of Denethor. Again, not that Denethor, just a name that has been recurring in the Legendarium. They come under the command of Denethor across the arid Lúthien into the realm of Thingol, where they are met as kin long lost that return. And they dwell in Asuryan, the land of seven rivers. But they are not of the Sindar specifically. That's going to be important as we move forward. And then we get this note about about Dairon the Minstrel, chief lore master of the Kingdom of Thingol, devising his runes. You'll remember that we've already had the creation of Tengwar over in Valinor, right? That Feanor perfects this runic form for the communication, for the written communication of the Elven language. And here we get another version of it, except that the Sindar don't really care about it. The Sindar don't use it. The Sindar don't want to write things down, because why would you write things down? The works fair and beautiful, while they still endure for eyes to see, are their own record, right? We live in this blessed age. Why are we keeping a record, a history of this blessed age? It's going to endure forever. But no, it is only in the falling of these great things that we begin to take our records. But the dwarves do take up this runic system, and that will form the basis of their written language in the years to come. So then we've basically caught up, because we have to deal with the Twilight of Valinor, right? As seen from Beleriand. The last sentence is like the one in Lord of the Rings, or maybe The Hobbit, when he says something about there not being much to tell about their time in Rivendell. Yes, you're right. Gosh, I think that is the Lord of the Rings, right? Is that when we return to... I'm remembering the piece that you're saying, Becky. Is it in the end of the Return of the King when we return to Rivendell and we stay there for a good long while before we undertake that last journey west back to the Shire? I think that might be where it is, but you're right. It's, again, another recurring point, I suppose, that Sam also has a line about this, I think, when he's talking about how that things which are good events which are good and joyous don't make for good stories. The good stories come from like woe and difficulty. I should look that up and pull it. Yeah. Oh, it is earlier, you think? I would need to have it right here to find this to find the passage. But yes. Okay, let's. I'm so close to being out of time already. Thank you, Becky, for calling that out. So let's take a look at the Twilight of Valinor as seen from the Beleriand perspective. In Beleriand in those days the elves walked, and the rivers flowed, and the stars shone, and the night flowers gave forth their scents, and the beauty of Melian was as the noon, and the beauty of Lúthien was as the dawn in spring. In Beleriand, King Thingol upon his throne was as the lords of the Mire, whose power is at rest, whose joy is as an air that they breathe in all their days, whose thought flows in a tide untroubled from the heights to the deeps. In Beleriand still at times rode Orome the Great, passing like a wind over the mountains, and the sound of his horn came down the leagues of the starlight, and the elves feared him for the splendour of his countenance and the great noise of the onrush of Nahar. But when the Valaroma echoed in the hills, they knew well that all evil things were fled far away. But it came to pass at last that the end of bliss was at hand, and the noontide of Valinor was drawing to its twilight. For as has been told and as is known to all, being written in lore and sung in many songs, Melkor slew the trees of the Valar with the aid of Ungoliant, and escaped, and came back to Middle-earth. Far to the north befell the strife of Morgoth and Ungoliant, and the great cry of Morgoth echoed through Beleriand, and all its people shrank for fear. For though they knew not what it foreboded, they heard then the herald of death. Soon afterwards Ungoliant fled from the north and came into the realm of King Thingol, and a terror of darkness was about her. But by the power of Melian she was stayed, and entered not into Naldoreth, but abode long time under the shadow of the precipices in which Dorthonion fell southward. And they became known as the Ered Gorgoroth, the mountains of terror, and none dared go thither or pass nigh them. Their life and light were strangled, and there all waters were poisoned. But Morgoth, as has before been told, returned to Angband and built it anew, and above its doors he reared the reeking towers of Thangorodrim, and the gates of Morgoth were but 150 leagues distant from the bridge of Menegroth, far and yet all too near. So, a brief accounting here of the return of Morgoth to Middle-earth. 150 leagues. A league is 3 English miles, so that's 450 miles, which is not very far at all. That is the distance from where I am sitting right now to, Houston, Texas, or to Galveston, right on the Gulf of Mexico, right there. It's about the distance from London, England, to Inverness in Scotland, which is to say that by modern measures, it is less than a day's travel. Even at the time, though, even in this fantasy world, not far enough for comfort. Proximate to Menegroth. I love the idea that we get that the elves of Beleriand, because of their separation from the Valar, because of their separation from the Valar to a certain extent, right? There is something happening here that I find interesting and find tricky to pin down. When we're given the account of Thingol, right? Thingol upon his throne was as the lords of the Mire, whose power is at rest, whose joy is an air that they breathe in all their days, whose thoughts flow in a tide untroubled from the heights to the deeps. That's fantastic, right? Thingol has been raised in his power, in his estimation, by witnessing the lights of Valinor, by seeing the trees of Valinor, yes, but also by his long association with Melian. So he is become like unto one of the Maiar, but still there is fear in Beleriand of Orome. Still there is a kind of intimidation of the elves of Beleriand by Orome, right? Not conscious, I'm sure. I don't think that Orome is really trying to frighten the elves of Beleriand or to psych them out in any way, but we are getting this idea that they fear him for the splendor of his countenance and the great noise of the onrush of Nahar, right? They themselves, with the sole exception of King Thingol, they themselves have never witnessed the lights of the trees. They themselves have never witnessed Valinor. And so this Valar coming among them, coming around them, coming nearby them, is a terrifying thing, literally a terrible thing, right? It is an awesome thing. It is a thing which causes them to be fearful, but also to recognize the good that is being done, right? It's just a different tier of life and experience, a whole different tier. And then we get the accounting of Morgoth and Ungoliant, and we'll pick up. You remember we discussed before about Ungoliant fleeing into the Ered Gorgoroth, into the Mountains of Terror, and now we learn that something else happened there, something that wasn't present in that previous account. Now we learn that there is something to the power of Melian, but by the power of Melian she was stayed and entered not into Naldoreth, but abode long time under the shadow of the precipices in which Dorthonion fell southward. Melian is protecting this space, and we're going to make that more explicit even as we move forward. But this is now our state. This is our condition. This is where we are as Feanor sets fire to the swan boats of Alqualonde here on the Middle Earth side of the strait leading to the Helcaraxe. Let's keep going here. Gosh, we've still got 3 more slides to cover in this chapter. We can do this. We can make it through 3 more slides, even if one of them is war. Now the orcs that multiplied in the darkness of the earth grew strong and fell, and their dark lord filled them with a lust of ruin and death, and they issued from Angband's gates under the clouds that Morgoth sent forth, and passed silently into the highlands of the north. Thence on a sudden a great army came into Beleriand and assailed King Thingol. Now in his wide realm, many elves wandered free in the wild, or dwelt at peace in small kindreds far sundered, and only about Menegroth in the midst of the land and along the Fallas in the country of the mariners were there numerous peoples. But the orcs came down upon either side of Menegroth, and from camps in the east between Kelon and Gallion, and west in the plains between Sirion and Narog, they plundered far and wide, and Thingol was cut off from Círdan at Eglarast. Therefore he called upon Denethor, and the elves came in force from Rhegion beyond Aros and from Assyriand, and fought the first battle in the wars of Beleriand. And the eastern host of the orcs was taken between the armies of the Eldar, north of the Andram and midway between Aros and Gallion, and there they were utterly defeated. And those that fled north from the great slaughter were waylaid by the axes of the Naugrim that issued from Mount Dolmed. Few, indeed, returned to Angband. But the victory of the elves was dear bought. For those of Assyriand were light-armed and no match for the orcs, who were shod with iron and iron-shielded and bore great spears with broad blades. And Denethor was cut off and surrounded upon the hill of Amon-Ereb. There he fell, and all his nearest kin about him, before the host of Thingol could come to his aid. Bitterly, though his fall was avenged when Thingol came upon the rear of the orcs and slew them in heaps, his people lamented him ever after and took no king again. After the battle, some returned to Assyriand, and their tidings filled the remnant of their people with great fear, so that thereafter they came never forth in open war, but kept themselves by wariness and secrecy, and they were called the Lyquendi, the green elves, because of their raiment of the colour of leaves. But many went north and entered the guarded realm of Thingol and were merged with his people. back when we discussed the separation of the elves, when we discussed the sundering of the elves, I talked about Tolkien's desire, in some sense, to create a functional schematic by which he could account for all the various kinds of elves that you encounter in fairy tales and in myth. That he wanted there to be elves of every sort. So we have elves who live in the forest and who flit by unseen. We have them now, the Lyquendi, right? We have the elves of the great grandeur. We have the elves of the Noldor, who are more like the gnomes of fairy tale, right? With their craftiness and with their skill in the creation of fine and beautiful things. This is certainly one of those moments, but it's also another step toward historicity. It's another step toward a historical account of what is happening in Beleriand that is separate from the quasi-mythical account that we received earlier, right? We're still continuing to navigate and to modulate these different rhetorical tones, these different narrative strategies as we move through the pages of the Silmarillion. And one of the things that I would love to do had I the time is to sit and figure out, as we're reading the Quenta here, which is presented to us as a unified work, but which I do not think is a unified work. We're not going to get the opportunity, sadly, to talk about this week, because we're not now definitely going to get to the creation of the sun and the moon. But that chapter feels very inconsistent with the rest of the Quenta in terms of its rhetorical style, in terms of its narrative voice. We're going to see a real shift there. And I would love to spend some time really doing close textual analysis and figuring out what the constituent parts of the Quenta were and where they came from, because we're clearly moving in terms of our understanding of time and space, as well as our perspective on our focal characters and their communities. So we have here the first battle of the Wars of Beleriand. Beleriand is going to see, unfortunately, a great many more battles before its time is done. And the elves here fighting back against the orcs. And a tremendous victory strategically, militarily, a tremendous victory, and the crushing of that orc army, right? The last few of whom, as they are returning north to Angband, fall under the axes of the Naugrim that issue from Mount Dolmad. So we have this alliance, this first alliance, if you like, here between elves and dwarves. But there is a price to be paid, and the price here is the shattering of the Nandor, in effect, right? The rendering of the Nandor, the end of the Nandor as a people, right? Some go north and kind of integrate themselves into the Menegroth, into King Thingol's community there, and the rest kind of disappear. The Lyquendi they never again go forth in war. They keep themselves through secrecy and wariness, and that's a strong elven tradition, in fairy tale and myth, but here born of a great sadness. Let's persevere here as we get into victory and defeat. We're so close now to finishing out this chapter and getting to the girdle of Melian, which will be a really great discussion. When Thingol came again to Menegroth, he learned that the orc host in the west was victorious and had driven Círdan to the rim of the sea. Therefore he withdrew all his people that his summons could reach within the fastness of Neldareth and Regian, and Melian put forth her power and fenced all that dominion round about with an unseen wall of shadow and bewilderment, the girdle of Melian, that none thereafter could pass against her will or the will of King Thingol, unless one should come with a power greater than that of Melian the Maya. And this inner land, which was long named Eglador, was after called Doriath, the guarded kingdom, land of the girdle. Within it there was yet a watchful peace, but without there was peril and great fear, and the servants of Morgoth roamed at will, save in the walled havens of the Falas. But new tidings were at hand, which none in Middle-earth had foreseen, neither Morgoth in his pits, nor Melian in Menegroth, for no news came out of Aman, whether by messenger, or by spirit, or by vision in dream, after the death of the trees. In this same time Feanor came over the sea in the white ships of the Teleri, and landed in the Firth of Drengist, and there burned the ships at Losgar. Well, I had inaccurately noted that I had 2 further slides, but it turned out I only had 1 further slide, so that's good. Here we are then with the formalization, I suppose, of the girdle of Melian, the protective barrier, which we have already seen in effect, right? This is why Ungoliant does not come into what is now called Doriath, the guarded kingdom, right? This is why Ungoliant is warded by the power of Melian. But now it is formalized. Now it becomes something that is more strict, more objective, an unseen wall of shadow and bewilderment. There isn't a there isn't a giant bulwark here set against the orcs from the north. Rather, it is confounding. It's the kind of thing that we will see again with elves in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. Within it there was a watchful peace, but without there was peril and great fear, and the servants of Morgoth roamed at will, save in the walled havens of the Falas. We see here again a kind of retreat. I think we can read here a resonance. We can read here a rhyme with the retreat of the Valar to Valinor and the raising of the Pelori, right? In the face of opposition and aggression and violence, we can withdraw and protect ourselves. And we're once again confronted with exactly the same question as we had when the Valar did exactly that to Valinor. Is this the right step? Is this the right action to take in the face of violence and danger and aggression? Well, we're about to find out, because new tidings are at hand. While none in Middle-earth had foreseen neither Morgoth and his pits nor Melian and Menegroth, for no news came out of a man, whether by messenger or by spirit or by vision in dream, after the death of the trees. In this same time, Feanor came over the sea in the white ships of the Telerian, landed in the Firth of Drengith, and there burned the ships at Losgar. The Noldor have returned to Middle-earth, and if things are difficult in Beleriand, if things are challenging in Beleriand, if things are complicated in Beleriand, things are about to get much more so in every possible measure. That, here we are at the 2-hour mark, is going to do it for this week's session of Stars and Swords. I'll return next week. We're definitely going to cover Chapter 11 next week, and probably Chapter 12 too. Yes, Chapter 12 is of Mana, and that's a really short chapter. So we'll definitely aim, I think we'll reset here a little bit, and rather than trying to play catch up, we will do 11 and 12 next week and continue on. That's a fairly short reading, but one that is phenomenally cosmologically significant, right? We're really going to do a major restructuring of our sense of Arda as a place, and our sense of the presence of the Valar within Arda. We're not yet going to lead to our final sundering. We're a long way away from our final sundering of Valinor from Arda, but we are going to be forced to reconceptualize some of the spatial relationships, certainly, but also some of the philosophical relationships that connect different strands of life in Arda as we move forward into an age of war and conquest and tempest. It's going to be a lot of fun to talk about, probably more fun to talk about than it would be to live through, that's for sure. Thank you so much for being here, Glad Rebecca, Glorfin David. It was so good to have you here. Next Sunday, again, I'm not yet sure of the time. My schedule for next weekend is remarkably constrained, so I'm not quite sure of the time, but I will let you know healthily in advance, and we'll be able to hopefully gather together and discuss the coming of the sun and the moon and of man to the shores of Middle-earth and Arda. It has been, of course, a great pleasure. If you were listening to this in its podcast form, then please do head on over to patreon.com/nextword. You can follow that page for free. That gets you access to the link every week to the live session. I generally send that out 4, 6, 8 hours before the live session actually happens, so that you can find the link there and come to this unlisted YouTube page where we hold these things live. You can come and chat in the little text box here and hang out with me during the live sessions, or you can even pledge some support. You can throw me a couple bucks a month over on patreon.com/nextword and help me continue to make more podcasts, including, as I've mentioned, this forthcoming Tolkien podcast. More on that in the weeks to come. There's a journey to undertake between here and the launching of that podcast, but I think it's going to be a ton of fun. I'm really looking forward to getting into it and being able to take a new perspective and some familiar techniques in terms of analyzing and celebrating the work of Professor Tolkien. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I will talk to you all again very soon. Hail and well met, Silmarillion heirs. I'll talk to you again very soon. Until then, take care. Thanks, guys.